Okay, this is lesson 7 of understanding the Old Testament. I am Reverend Sherri L. Jackson from Alexandria, Louisiana. Tonight, our study is Isaac, Abraham's test of faith. We are continuing with the study of Genesis. We have last week we talked about Sarah, Hagar, Abraham, and Ishmael. Well, tonight we continue. We understand that even though Ishmael came along, he was not the promised child that God had told Abraham and Sarah about. However, God still had a plan for Ishmael, which we talked about. It does not matter how the child was conceived, under what circumstances. At the end of the day, God has purpose for each one of us. But tonight we're going to continue with Isaac, because at the end of the day, Isaac is the one that God promised Sarah and Abraham. So let's review real quick. Abraham and Sarah, we understand they were sad because they had no children, and God had promised them that they were going to have a son, and his name would be Isaac. He would serve God and obey his commandments. Sarah was 90 years old. She was too old to have a baby, but God said that Sarah would have a baby. And we also talked about that it was not uncommon for a woman who was barren to ask her husband to go into or to have sex with her maid servant so that she would be able to bring forth a child. This was certainly not a 21st century idea, but it certainly was a um, biblical or ancient Near East where these stories would have taken place, and it was not common. It was not uncommon, because for a woman to be barren, it was a shame brought on her husband, because he would not have an heir, and specifically a son to pass down his name and his property. So Sarah took it upon herself to ask Abraham to go into the tent of Hagar, which brought about a child, Ishmael. We also understand that after that child got a little older, Sarah wanted to make sure that that child would be put away. And so tonight we're going to continue on and see exactly what takes place. If you look at Genesis 21, and I ask you to read those other chapters to fill in some gaps that we were not going to be able to talk about, but we continue and remember in the grand story of God redeeming us back to himself, and he was going to do it through Abraham. And the story has to continue. If Ishmael is not the child, then God must be faithful and keep his promise and bring about a child which would be named Isaac. Ishmael, after Isaac came, Ishmael became a threat to Abraham's heir through Sarah, and there was some tension there. But I want you to take a look at Genesis 21, verses 1 and 2. Now remember, God had promised that through Abraham, through Sarah, that a child would come forth. If Ishmael was not the child, then God was going to have to keep his promises. If you look at verses 1 and 2, you're going to see some repetition. It says, and the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abram a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. So 3 times God emphasizes, or the Moses writes, that God said, God promised, God spoke, which lets us know that God is going to bring forth the son that he promised, not Hagar and Abraham, but Sarah and Abraham. So that's real important, as he said, as he promised, which God spoken. So, of course, if we continue reading, we see that Sarah did conceive as God had promised, and the child was going to be called Isaac. Now, the word Isaac means laughter. Now, remember, as always, names have meaning. And Isaac means laughter. Now, remember, we talked about last week that Abraham laughed because, God said Sarah is going to bring this child. And so the name Isaac means laughter. For number one, he's going to be a source of joy for his parents as a fulfillment of God's promise. And number two, his parents laughed in amazement and unbelief when told that God had chosen to bless them by giving them a son so late in life. Now, I've heard many lessons and many sermons, talking down and bad about Abraham and Sarah for laughing. But, let's be real. Laughter, sometimes we have to laugh to quit, to stop, for not crying because we don't want to cry, so we laugh. Well, I believe this is the kind of laughter this was. This was a laughter of amazement that surely, God, how in the world is this going to take place? But certainly, God did promise that he was going to bring about a child, and it was going to be through Sarah and Abraham. But if you go to verse 4, Abraham circumcised his son Isaac being 8 days old as God had commanded him. Now remember, we talked about last week that God had said that Abraham should have all males at least 8 days old as soon as possible to have them circumcised. And that circumcision was so that they would remember, so that they will know how all of this came about. So Abraham kept his commitment to circumcise the child, and he did when Isaac was 8 years old. Now, Abraham was 100 years old when God had finally brought Isaac to pass. So just think how long Sarah and Abraham had to wait before God brought about the promise that he had given them more than 25 years ago. Abraham, we call him the father of faith, and we've talked about throughout our lessons talking about Abraham is that he went through a lot of things. He and Sarah went through a lot of bumps and bruises in those 25 years, but God, they were faithful. And so whatever it seems that God has not brought to pass in your life, um, it could take some time, but we have to remember that if God has spoken it, if God has promised it, he will bring it. He will bring it to pass. As always, if you have a question, you can send it through chat, or of course, ask it publicly if you feel comfortable in doing so. So they have the child, and lo and behold, there is a twist of events. And we're kind of like skipping around because we're not going to be able to do everything verse for verse. But I want to get to the part about Isaac is finally here, but God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable and take his son to be sacrificed. We're in chapter 22 now. Verse 1 says, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I tell you of. Now, 25 years they waited for this child, and now God says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and go up to Moriah. What in the world is going on? Now, remember when we first started talking, we said that the Old Testament is the foundation for the New Testament. And as we go through this story, I want you to think about where you hear some of these same things in the New Testament. He says, take now thy son, thy only son, whom thou lovest, get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him for a burnt offering upon a mountain I will tell you of. When we read a book, we are often able to work out how the story will end. But sometimes when we read something, we say, or even see something on TV, we say, I never thought that would happen. Certainly, after they waited for this child, I can imagine that Abraham and Sarah said, I never thought that would happen. But God tells Abraham to take your son, your only son, whom you love, go to the region and sacrifice him. That's got to be a hard pill for Abraham to swallow. God had called him already to leave his friends and his father's house. He was separated from his nephew. He was told to send Ishmael away. And now the only blood relative left to him, his son, God says, take that son to be sacrificed. That's worth thinking about. So Abraham has 5 great sacrifices that he's had to give up. At least 5 major things God has asked him to do. His country, his extended family, his nephew Lot, his son Ishmael, and now the one that they've been waiting for, God is asking him to take that son and sacrifice him. Each one of these sacrifices was naturally dear, but they resulted in greater blessings. So it's one thing to leave your country, it's another thing to leave your aunts and uncles and cousins. And then the nephew Lot, who would have been considered his heir, they had to separate. And then Ishmael, and now Isaac. Pastor Green, did you want to add something?
I would like to,
Okay.
if it's okay.
Yes, sir.
When we consider the whole group of what is going on in the mind of Abraham. 25 years to get this boy. Now he's about 14 years old, so we're about 40 years into the making. And at a 14-year-old headed to a mountain to be sacrificed. And then he asked his daddy a pointed question. He said, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where is the lamb? Which tell me that he had been going with his father before to sacrifice a lamb, but there was no lamb. Then Abraham made the bold statement that God himself will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. I want to just drop a point of history with us, all of us, to study. When you said Mount Moriah, that is the same geographical mountain range that Jesus was crucified on. By the time he got here, it was called Calvary. Same basic range of mountains. And just to drop that note in while we're studying and looking at the history and the geography of that place, that Abraham offered his son, Mount Moriah. Later, God offered his son. As you say, we need to look for the parallel in the New Testament. That's a powerful experience to offer your child. And I don't know anybody could do that. We usually fight for our children and insult people and do all kinds of other things, even when they just correct our children sometimes. But here is this father who waited 40 years to get this boy to this point and is willing to give him up in obedience to God. We can see why God called Abraham his friend. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. So, we've been talking about Abraham's faith, the father of faith. You know, he just left. But now there's going to be a test of faith. Let's see what Abraham is really made of. Abraham, when God asked him to do that, might have concluded that God did not know his own mind, that he was an erratic planner, unsure of himself. But this was not his experience of God. The alternative was for Abraham to say, my mind is too small to grasp all that God is doing. I must endeavor to trust God, who has always proved himself faithful. So, in one sense, Abraham could have been thinking and, just thinking about the human condition and human nature. Okay, God, you said you will ask me to leave everything. You asked me to go to a place that I didn't know. You say that my wife, who is barren, was going to have a son, and one was going to be the father of many nations. My name was going to be great. But yet, you're saying, take this child to sacrifice him. That just doesn't seem to measure up. And that's with Abraham's human mind. But even with not, it doesn't make sense. And God sometimes just doesn't make sense. But Abraham did exactly what God asked him to do. So Abraham rose the next day, got on his donkey, took 2 servants, his son, and wood for the burnt offering, and set off for Mount Moriah. There was no debate, just unquestioning obedience. He had a 3-day journey to think through a 3-day journey to think through what God asked of him. During that time, Abraham must have tried to work out how God could keep his promise to him, and at the same time ask him to sacrifice the child through whom that promise was to be fulfilled. Abraham saw a solution to the dilemma in verse 5. As he leaves his servants at the foot of Mount Moriah, he says, "We will worship and then we will come back to you." This was not an empty promise. So let's just look at this here. Remember, we talk about the parallel, the things that are parallel, the Old Testament, the New Testament. Abraham takes his son up the mountain, and we see that also in the New Testament when Jesus, the sacrificial lamb, was taken up the mountain. Now, Abraham didn't know what God was going to do, but his faith was in the promise that God had made. His faith was in the fact that God said, "I'm going to make you a father of many nations." Well, if he took Isaac, that wouldn't make sense. So his faith was in God's word. He didn't know how it was going to take place, but somehow God was going to have to preserve Isaac. Do we have any questions thus far? I'm sorry, I see a question. Okay, we had a question that said, why does it call Isaac his only son if there was Ishmael? How I would surmise it is that he was talking about the son of promise, not so much dismissing Ishmael, but he's talking about the line that will come through Abraham and Sarah. So he would be the only child when you consider the line of Abraham and Sarah, because that was the way it was to always go. Hagar and Abraham was not God's. It was a common practice, but it was not God's will for Abraham and Sarah in this particular instance. Okay? I hope that answered your question. So, we do see in Hebrews 11 and 17 in that whole, you remember that chapter in Hebrew 11 is called the Faith Hall of Fame, so to speak. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Abraham expected a resurrection. So perhaps that even if he did have to sacrifice Isaac, God would raise Isaac because God had made these promises to him. And God does not lie. The promises could only be fulfilled through Isaac. Therefore, if God required him to take Isaac's life, then God had to raise him again. Doubt laughs at such reasoning and argues that there is no historical precedent for it, but Abraham put his faith in God. So just think about the times that God has promised something to you and it just does not make sense. 25 years past, 10 years past, whatever the amount of time, but God keeps his promises, and our faith has to be in the fact, not in the situation, but in God's word, because he does not go back on his word. Even though it seems like it could take a long time, and I'm one guilty of trying to manipulate the situation or help the situation out. Pastor Green, did you have something?
One of the truths that we may could piggyback on is that time to us is measured as space and place because we don't have much of it. But time to God, you know, God has eternity to do what he needs to do. And so sometimes we be looking at it through a finite mind when we're talking about the infinite. And so God knew from the beginning what his timeline would be and look like. The truth you said is Abraham didn't know. And so Abraham is working with a finite mind, and he's being obedient and trusting an infinite God that, you know, and he trusts God. One of the things we have to remember, not have to, good to remember, there come a time in our life when we cannot tell anyone what God is working out with us. We just have to trust God. There was no way Abraham was going to tell Sarah, I'm going to take your firstborn son after you tried for whatever, you're 100 years old. I'm going to take him to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. She'd have been calling child protection, 911, might have had a different ending to the story. But he just told God. He took his boy and a couple of his friends and he talked to God about it. And there come a time in our life when we just have to tell God about our situation. And it works. We're reading about Abraham tonight because he trusted God and kept his promise, or we wouldn't be reading about it. And you're absolutely right. Some things we will never understand. We just have to trust God. Kind of what I see.
Okay. So at the end of the day, God did provide a resurrection. Figuratively speaking, of course, but not until Abraham had said his goodbyes, not until Isaac's willing submission, and not until after the knife was raised. It was then at the last minute when it was quite clear that Abraham intended to obey God that he was told to stop. So God wanted to see where Abraham was, not so much in his faith, but in his obedience. God already knew what he was going to do, but he wanted Abraham to fully obey him. Abraham had to do his part. We say that thing, we take one step and God to take two. Well, this exactly that kind of situation. Abraham had to do his part. He said goodbye to his servant. Isaac had to be willing, because Isaac could have run, like Pastor Green said, he was 14 years old. He could have run or anything, but he willingly submitted. Now, where have we heard that at? Christ willingly submitted to be our sacrifice. And not until after the knife was raised, and then God stopped things. He said, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me, your son, your only son. That little phrase, now I know you fear God. Now I know you reverence God. Now I know you honor God. Now I know you are fully committed to God. There are times when God has asked us to do something, to give up something, to sacrifice something. Not that he doesn't want us to have that thing, but it's often a thing that is precious to us. Are we willing to give that thing up to show our obedience to God? And after all of this takes place, then Abraham sees the ram. Now, the ram perhaps had been there all the time. But when Abraham had got Isaac ready to sacrifice him, God tells him to stop. Then he sees the ram in the thicket. And Abraham names this place Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. So God had a solution. Where have we heard this before? In the New Testament, Christ was our ram. Christ was sacrificed in our place. We use that phrase, God has a ram in the bush. Well, he certainly did on Calvary, because it should have been us. But Christ was sacrificed, and he was a willing participant. Pastor Green?
The joy we have looking back is that Adam's sin caused all of us to be under a death sentence. Christ, from Genesis, the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world. So God's plan never really wavered in our salvation. The joy is, as you said earlier, is he allowed Abraham and his family, that the baby would come through his family. Not a perfect family, just as much dysfunctional as all the rest of us. But God made choice of him and then tested him with his son Isaac. And sometimes we used to say around the church, faith untested can't be trusted. Well, our faith will be tested someday. And in this situation, he had promised that all the families of the world will be blessed through you. And that's our connection to Jesus. Jesus' love for us. And the joy that I find in this piece, when I read the story over and over about Abraham, is that God loved each one of us so much. It doesn't matter what we look like, where we come from, whether we're crippled, whether we're physical. It just doesn't matter. God loved each of us so much that he gave himself, his only begotten son, himself, that he could die and pay our sin debt. And so he paid a debt he didn't owe for us, for a debt we could not pay. And then he let us look at it in Genesis to see that Abraham went through the same terrible ordeal in sacrificing his son mentally. Mentally, Isaac was dead. Mentally. And Abraham raised that knife. He didn't raise that knife just for fun. God had to stop him. And I believe this from the depths of my heart. When we surrender our will to God and allow God to work through us, we will do things that you and I know is impossible for us to do on our own. So, we got a beautiful example here. Now, keep in mind, Abraham didn't have all the tools we have. He'd never gone to Sunday school. He hadn't been baptized. He had not been given orientation into a church or right hand of fellowship. He just believed God. Abraham believed God. And because he believed God, it was counted unto him as being a friend of God, a man of faith, one who trusts God. Now, we have all the tools and the whole book. I wonder, do we believe God on the same level? It's kind of worth thinking about, isn't it?
Okay. Thank you so much. You are so right. We are on this side of the cross, and Abraham went through the test and all of those things without having anything, any inkling of what was going to go on. But on this side of the cross, we have the benefit of Abraham's bumps and bruises and his faith. Okay, so God is not only the God of the impossible. Abraham already knew that, but God in his mercy acted to find a solution that Abraham was wrestling with. God himself had provided solution as the sacrifice of the substitute ram caught in the thicket made clear. So, again, Abraham was doing this, and perhaps he was shaky, he was human, but he was doing it, and his mind had to be going a million miles a minute because, again, on one hand, God says, I'm gonna make you a father of many nations, your name's gonna be great. Took him outside and looked at the stars. You see all these stars, your descendants are going to be as many as these stars, but yet you're taking me, you want me to take my only son and sacrifice him. But God had the solution to the problem. But at the same time, God needed to show Abraham how he would solve man's greatest problem, the problem of human sin and of God's hatred of sin and love for the sinner. God would sacrifice a substitute. So this is the first time that we will get to see how God is going to solve the problem, the sin problem that took place in the garden. This God gives us a glimpse of how this is going to take place. It's going to take place through a sacrifice. It's going to take place on a mountain. It's going to take place with a substitute. So again, when you read the Old Testament stories, always keep in mind that it is foundational for the New Testament. That's why I love the first 5 books of the Bible, because in the first 5 we get everything that we're going to need basically to understand what's going on in the New Testament. So this what God asked Abraham to do is a glimpse of what he's going to do on Calvary. So we've kind of like talked about Mount Moriah that Pastor Green talked about earlier. What was significant about this mountain? Mount Moriah is identified with Jerusalem, and on the mount, the temple of sacrifice will later be built by Solomon. It was on this same mountain that God's own beloved son would be sacrificed. Abraham was standing on the place of sacrifice, the place where Jesus would be crucified. What circumstances could have better equipped Abraham to see how God's promises to him were to be fulfilled? So everything that God was doing with Abraham was to get Jesus to Calvary, because when we keep going down the line of Abraham's descendants, we will eventually get to David, who will eventually get us to Jesus. He had almost sacrificed his son for God, but God would certainly sacrifice his son for him and for all of us. The ram that God had provided as a substitute for Isaac was a shadow of the greater substitutionary lamb, which was Christ, which would take place on Calvary. Okay, are there any questions? Let's see if I don't see any questions. Okay. Can you imagine the conversation that Abraham had with Isaac on the way home? I thought I was going to have to take your life, but God has given you back to me. But more than that, I saw where all of the promises that God has given us are leading. They will find their fulfillment one day on that same mountain. For there God's own son will be offered up for salvation of men and women of every nation. God's son will be raised up and return to his father. So there's that resurrection. Remember that I said earlier that perhaps in Abraham's mind, okay, God is going to, we're going to sacrifice Isaac, but surely God is going to raise him, is going to resurrect him. Well, when it comes to God's only son, who will be sacrificed, there will be a resurrection. So as a father who almost sacrificed a son, I can just begin to grasp something of the intensity of God's love for us in sacrificing his son. Isaac was spared, but Jesus was not spared. Jesus was not spared. So if we go back to verse 15, and on, we talk about Abraham's faith, and his is tied to his obedience. Through your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. This is the first time that the word obey appears in the scripture. Obedience and faith are united in scripture. Faith is more than a mental assent that says, I believe God exists. Faith is more than trust. It is a trust that obeys even in the dark, even when we do not have all of the answers. Charles Spurgeon says faith and obedience are bound up in the same bundle. He that obeys God trusts God, and he that trusts God obeys God. So it's one thing to say, I trust God. It's another thing to move forth in action. As they talk about faith without works is dead. But for Abraham, it was not just enough to trust, but to obey. So faith and obedience goes together. And so for us on this side with the New Testament, and we talk about the gospel, is not enough just to believe the gospel, but we ought to obey it. So what does the Old Testament illustrate? Abraham offers of Isaac. This is a clear picture of the death of Christ on the cross. Abraham represents God, Isaac represents Christ, and the wood represents the cross. Now, perhaps you hadn't seen this before in your studying, or but when you see it now, it should come crystal clear on where God was trying to go with Abraham. Again, God didn't just choose Abraham just to be choosing him. There was an ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose was to get to lead to Christ, which would be the ultimate sacrifice. So what God wanted all along was not the death of Abraham's son, but Abraham's unquestioned obedience. For Abraham to demonstrate his faith, and for God to demonstrate his grace. And so when we look at the New Testament, God demanded perfection. We couldn't meet the standard, so God sent his son, who was a perfection in our place. God demanded payment for sin. We couldn't make the payment, so God sent his son, who paid the price for our sin. So again, this is the parallel with that story with Abraham and the sacrificing of Isaac. Okay. So what does this mean for us? God knew we were poor, so he sent Christ to make us rich. God knew we were in bondage, so he sent Christ to make us free. And what he demanded from us, he gave to us. What we needed, he provided. There that goes again with the ram in the bush, Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. Pastor Green?
Well, I was listening and you were on a roll. I said, boy, she did her homework. She got her story down pat. Thank God that you connected the two for all of us, because sometimes there are people who don't understand the Old Testament as being the foundation for the New Testament. Without the Old Testament, we really can't build a superstructure without that foundation. The old is in the new contained, and the new is the old explained. And so once we see Jesus and once we see the connection of the gospel and how Abraham or Abram was called from a strange land, no church, no Sunday school, no baptism, no BTU, no Baptist training, no associations, no district meetings, no national convention, a man who was considered a pagan and a pagan worshiping idol gods, that God called, commissioned, gave him family, made a promise to him, and how we see Abraham's descendants. Many of them are still looking for the Messiah, that Jesus that have already come. And how many of my Jewish friends have no clue about the New Testament or about God's purpose and salvation for saving us through Jesus. And so I thank God for you, Reverend Jackson, doing a great work and helping us build our foundation that all of us can stand on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So what is, how do we conclude this lesson? What is it that we should know? Abraham's faith was an obedient faith. It cost him to serve God. At times he was traveling in the dark. He trusted God not just in days of great blessing, but in days of hardship. When he was going through an emotional and psychological wringer, for Abraham, the giver was more important than the gifts that were given him. Can we say that? Are there things in our lives that we are reluctant to put on God's altar? Things we are reluctant to sacrifice, to let go of, plans and dreams that we do not want God to interfere with. Just sit with that for a moment. Think about the things that perhaps God has asked to put on the altar. Things that we've become reluctant, don't want to sacrifice. But remember, God asked Abraham to give his best. So God is not going to ask us to give something that we don't want ourselves. Well, that wouldn't make a sacrifice. That wouldn't be a sacrifice. But he sometimes asks us to let go of our own will, our own plans. And it's all about obedience. It's all about obedience. So the response of many people who read this passage for the first time is, how could God ask Abraham to make such a sacrifice, even if he knew he would prevent him from carrying it out? But the question we should really be asking is, how could God make the sacrifice he made in giving up his son to die on the cross for our sin? How could God go through with that? And so we end with John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. John 3:16. So again, this story of Abraham, Isaac, has purpose, and it leads us to John 3:16, because at the end of the day, this grand story, this grand drama that we have in the Bible leads us to the great sacrifice of God's only son. Okay, are there any questions?